Good evening, and thank you very much for coming out this evening. I'm very much looking forward to our forum presentation, and very relevant, very important issue, to say the least. Just a few announcements before I introduce our guest for the evening. First of all, as typical, we would like to thank Perimeter Church for hosting our forums. Also, thanks, as we typically do, to Wayne Whitaker for handling our sound system, also our IT issues. If you have any IT issues of your own, any IT problems of your own, I can't recommend anyone more gifted to be of assistance than Wayne Whitaker. And of course to John Barry for video recording our forum. So we appreciate that as always. Now, over the last 13 years, the Areopagus has sponsored nearly 300 seminars and forums on topics related to Christian apologetics, history, science, significant books, and contemporary cultural issues. We also sponsor in-depth semester-length seminars on many topics, oftentimes here at Perimeter Church and also out at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church in Cobb County, Mount Bethel United Methodist Church, and other venues. Excuse me, other venues. For more information on the ministry of the Areopagus, including some of our publications, please visit our literature table in the back there. And also, if you're not currently on our email contact list and would like to be informed regarding upcoming seminars and forums, we have a sign-up sheet on the table as well. We also have, of course, this evening, several books authored by our guest, Dr. George Yancey. And in particular, I wanted to highlight a couple of his publications. Probably the one that's getting the most attention right now is a book he wrote entitled Hostile Environment, Understanding and Responding to Anti-Christian Bias. And perhaps you heard Dr. Yancey interviewed on the Michael Medved show, radio syndicated talk show yesterday. Also, he was featured very prominently on Dennis Prager's radio talk show last week as well. Other books that I think you'll find particular interest, a book entitled So Many Christians, So Few Lions. Is there Christianophobia in the United States? Presumably that's a rhetorical question. And then also Compromising Scholarship, Religious and Political Bias in American Higher Education. So all three are very, very highly recommended, all three extremely informative. Now, Dr. George Yancey is a professor of sociology at the University of North Texas, specializing in race and ethnicity, biracial families, and anti-Christian bias in academia and in American society in general. Dr. Yancey grew up in San Diego, California. He got his undergraduate degree from West Texas State University. And then after graduating from West Texas State with a BS in economics, he attended the University of Texas at Austin and received his doctorate in sociology in 1995. Now, for the first several years of his career, he studied race relations in America, in particular the dynamics of multiracial churches. Several years ago, he began to study academic bias against Christians and then anti-Christian attitudes in our culture in general. In 1999, he began teaching at the University of North Texas, and today he's working to establish a program for Christian studies at the institution. It will be the first center on a secular campus that specializes in research designed to serve Christians and Christian organizations. He's a prolific author, co-author, and co-editor of several books, including the ones I mentioned earlier, Compromising Scholarship, Religious and Political Bias in American Higher Education, Dehumanizing Christians, Cultural Competition in a Multicultural World, There Is No God, Atheists in America, and of course, Hostile Environment, Understanding and Responding to Anti-Christian Bias, in addition to the others that I mentioned as well. Now, I thought the blurb to Dr. Yancey's book, Hostile Environment, was particularly worth citing here in brief. And so to quote from the blurb on the book, the only good Christian is a dead Christian. In our heated cultural environment, comments like this are becoming increasingly common. Sometimes Christians are too quick to claim that they've been discriminated against or persecuted. But Christians are not just being paranoid or alarmist. Anti-Christian hostility is very real. In his book, sociologist George Yancey explores the phenomenon of Christianophobia, an intense animosity against Christians and the Christian faith. Among some circles, opposition to Christianity manifests much like other historic prejudices such as anti-Semitism or racial discrimination. And while Christianophobia in the United States does not typically rise to the violent levels of religious persecution in other parts of the world, oftentimes Christians are still treated in ways that perpetuate negative stereotypes and contribute to cultural war acrimony. Dr. Yancey unpacks the underlying perspectives and root causes of Christianophobia, and he considers to what extent Christians have themselves contributed to this anti-Christian hostility. In this truthful yet hope-filled treatise, Yancey shows how Christians can respond more constructively, diffusing tensions and working toward a common goal. So, again, if you're not familiar with his works, again, we have several featured in the back there, and it's a real honor and a privilege to have with us this evening Dr. George Yancey. So if you would please extend a very warm welcome to him.
Hi, I'm going to apologize up front. I've had some allergies just grab me the past couple of days, and so actually like I'm in Texas, so Georgia may be a cure for that. And so I normally have a lot more energy when I talk. Probably won't be quite as energetic tonight because of those allergies and stuff, so I just want to apologize ahead of time. I want to look at the topic of Christianophobia. And when the topic comes up, there's three questions people need to have addressed. First, does it exist? Second, even if it exists, is there a lot of it? I mean, maybe it exists because there's a crank out there. Okay, yeah, that person. And then third, does it make a difference? So I'm going to hopefully touch on all three questions going through this. To do that, I'm probably going to skim over some of my research, how it was done, but I'd be happy to talk about it more in length with the questions and answers. And then at the end of the day, hopefully when you leave here, someone asks you these questions, you'll have some answers that you can give. So anyways, Christianophobia, anti-Christian bias and discrimination in American education and culture. First, let's define it. Okay, go ahead. Okay, here's a definition. An irrational animosity towards or hatred of Christians or Christianity in general. Now, there is actually a book out called Christianophobia that concentrates on anti-Christian hatred around the world. And there's some really nasty stuff that's happening. As you all probably well know, people are being killed, churches burnt, things of this nature. And Christianophobia there really is just Christianity in general. If you're a Christian and you're in the wrong country, you can really face some awful consequences. Thankfully, that's not here. That's not true in the United States. It manifests itself differently in the United States. Generally, Christianophobia is towards more conservative Christians. And of course, the sort of violence that we see around the world does not manifest itself here in the United States. So, I want to be clear, I'm going to be even more clear later on. When we're talking about Christianophobia, we're not talking about what we see in the Middle East. We're talking about something that is still very problematic, but we want to differentiate. So, to look at this, what I did was I took a national survey. And this national survey had what we call thermometer questions. A thermometer from 0 to 100. So they ask you, on 0 to 100, how do you feel about this group? So 0, you hate them. 100, you love them. As it was just said, as Jeffrey just said, I'm a University of Texas Longhorn. So you ask me the Longhorns, it's 100. You ask me about the Aggies, it's -5. Alabama, I'm about 50 probably, so, hey, you're not Sooners or Aggies, so that's great. They asked about a variety of different groups. Included were racial groups and religious groups. So what I did was I created an average of how people rated their religious and racial groups. And then I was curious, did you rank some of those groups a standard deviation below that average? Here's why I did this. Let's say someone ranked a group 25. You're thinking, man, they don't really like that group. But the average was 20. They're just a curmudgeon, They're just a mean old cuss. And, that 25 really is indicative that they like that group. On the other hand, someone else ranks a group of 90, but they're ranking everyone else 100, then they don't like that group. People tend to, have a certain level in which they rank groups. So I was curious whether you ranked a group a standard deviation below the average of all the racial and religious groups. Okay, let's go and take a look at this. In this chart, I don't know how clearly you can see it, but in this chart, I document the percentage of people who ranked a group a standard deviation below the others. Was rejected the most were atheists. About 45% of people ranked them a standard deviation below. The second one, though, was fundamentalist Christians. And the question was fundamentalist Christians, so there's no doubt it's not fundamentalists in general, Christian fundamentalists. You can see that about 32% of the people ranked them a standard deviation below the average. Compare that to Muslims. Muslims is just slightly lower, but it's not what we would call significant, all right? Now, let me ask you this question. How often in the past, say, year, have you watched a TV show and people talk about Islamophobia? Can I see your hands? If you've heard in the past year. Okay. Except for me, hearing from me, how often in the past year have you heard of Christianophobia? One person. The level of animosity is the same. You can see Mormons is lower, and then the racial groups is pretty low, and I won't go into that. But you can see that there is a good percentage of people who have some degree of animosity towards Christian fundamentalists. Who are these people? Well, what I wanted to do was compare these people to Christians and compare them to people who believe the Bible is the Word of God. So, 44.1% of those who believe the Bible is the Word of God are male. 52.6% of those who have this animosity towards Christians are male. You can see that those with anti-Christian hostility are also more likely to be white. They're more likely to have a bachelor's degree, almost half of them do. They're more likely to make more than $100,000 a year. When sociologists talk about people with power in society, we also talk about race, class, gender, education. People with anti-Christian hostility are whiter, more male, more educated, and more wealthy than your average Christian. The last two. It's not surprising that they're more likely to be politically liberal and less likely to attend church weekly or a religious institution weekly. Now, I throw that in there to suggest that who tends to have social power, tends to be irreligious, tends to be progressive. These are individuals who tend to be in cultural areas of our society. So when you think about it, when you think about academia, think about the media, entertainment, arts. This sort of describes these individuals. And I'm not showing you the breakdown for those who don't like Muslims. I can tell you that among those, they are white and male, but they also tend to be lower educated and have less income. So while the percentages of people with, let's say, Islamophobia is the same as the percentages of people with Christianophobia, those with Christianophobia have more social power. Now, this is a view from 30,000 feet. I've been in an airplane today. I look down 30,000 feet, I can see little tiny ants running around. So I can see certain patterns. That's called quantitative work. But to get among those ants, to go down and be among them is qualitative work, to go and ask them questions. I was fortunate enough to do a project that allowed me to ask those questions. I was studying cultural progressive activists. And the demographics of these cultural progressive activists was quite interesting. We asked them a lot of questions on how they felt about Christians. But let me show you the demographics of these cultural progressive activists. My sample was 93.6% white, 64.1% male. Over half made more than $75,000 a year. 43.5% had a graduate degree. And look at this, 16% had a doctorate degree. Highly educated group. 75%, almost 75% were atheist or agnostic, and only 2% were born-again Christian. I didn't ask them about politics, so I don't have a demographics. Their answers indicated that they tend to be pretty progressive. So this is a sample of people you would expect to have Christianophobia. So with the survey, I asked a series of open-ended questions so I can read in their own words how they felt about Christians. And let me show you just some of the hostile quotes. All right? I want them all to die in a fire. Not just die, but die in a fire. Churches and houses of religion should be designated as nuclear test zones. Kill them all, let their gods sort them out. We'd like to give them all a frontal lobotomy, line them up and shoot them, and then Jeffrey stole my line, the only good Christian is a dead Christian. The reason why the book is titled So Many Christians, So Few Lions was about 6 or 7 times my respondent had some variation of that saying. I was like, how is this happening? So I went online. I punched in So Many Christians, So Few Lions. And now if you punch in, hopefully my book comes up first. But if it doesn't, what you'll see is you can buy t-shirts, So Many Christians, So Few Lions. You can buy bumper stickers, So Many Christians, So Few Lions. You can even buy a baby onesie, So Many Christians, So Few Lions. Yes, I saw that. And just for the heck of it, I punched in Confederate flag, which, of course, I'm not a fan. On Google and Yahoo, you can't find that in selling it. So I think they're equally hateful, but one you can buy and one you cannot. And so that's why I titled the book, because it actually is a saying among some of these individuals. Now, we could spend, the next 10, 15 minutes looking at these hostile quotes. Believe me, this is only skimming the surface. I put a lot more in my book, just to show the point that this is an irrational hatred. It is not that, those Christians, I don't get along with them, I don't like them. When you're wanting someone to die in a fire as a joke, I don't joke like that. I wish you died in a fire. I don't joke like that. And one of the reasons to illustrate that is, try to find a bumper sticker that says, so many Jews, so few ovens. So I would argue that this is an irrational hatred. The question is this just a few cranks, or is there something systematic about it? In my book, I really tried to show how this is systematic. This is not, not everyone had a sick quote, but there is something systematic in how they think. I want to show you a little piece of that. Don't have the time to really go into all of it, but there is a theory of animalistic dehumanization that I want to talk about. And these are some of the qualities of animalistic dehumanization. Lack of culture. Because animals don't have culture. And thus when you dehumanize other people, you say, well, they don't have culture, they're just a bunch of animals. Coarseness. That the notion that these people are not refined, they're coarse, you don't want to be around them, you want to stay away from them. Amorality. People have no morals. And that came out. Irrationality. We don't think of animals as being smart. So when we dehumanize others, we don't think of them as being smart. One of the ways African Americans were dehumanized was it was thought that they were a little more than animals. They weren't rational. They couldn't think like humans. And then finally, childlikeness. That these individuals, they're like little kids to be led around. Now, I'm only going to look at the last one, but I can tell you that evidence of all 5 of those qualities were in the statements of my respondents. Okay, so let's look at the last one. Childlikeness. You can define it as seeing outgroup members as immature and easily manipulated. They're like kids. Kids need to be taken care of. They need to be taken care of. Childlikeness. Now I'm just going to show you a few of the responses. I can definitely get more. My survey included about almost 4,000 respondents. Not all of them filled out all the questionnaires, but I got a lot of responses. Okay, so here's one of the comments that came out a lot. That Christians are childlike and manipulated by leaders. They're like little kids, and these evil leaders are manipulating them. They can't think for themselves. For example, this female, aged 26 to 35 with a bachelor's degree, said that the leaders are deceptive and power-hungry individuals who know God in a political sense to rally their supporters. They play to people's emotions daily. That came out a lot. Talking about Christians, they think with their emotions. They don't think with their rationality. They're not humans who think rationally. They think with their emotions, and these people play off their emotions. So it sort of takes away the agency that Christians are supposed to have. Or this comment here. Their movement leaders are the worst type of manipulative authoritarian scum, and their millions of followers are sad, weak people who are all too willing to give up their self-respect and liberty for a fantasy. That's a male, age 26 to 35 with a bachelor's degree. There was a lot of quotes talking about the leaders manipulating these Christians who could not think for themselves. So, childlikeness. A common theme among some of the childlikeness was, now you think about animalistic dehumanization, so what animal would you refer to? You're not talking about like an ape, like they did with African Americans. No, the common animal was the sheep. I feel that they are sheep, not thinking for themselves. See how that, little kids, they got to be directed. Or this one. Poor thinkers, warped logic, they worship a shepherd, so they are quick. What animal comes to mind? Or this one. They behave like sheep with guns. So they're sheep, but they have guns, so they're dangerous. This is what I mean talking about as far as dehumanization. When you humanize someone, you take them for who they are. You try to understand them. When you break things down to these sort of stereotypes, you're dehumanizing them. Are there Christians who act like sheep? Yes. There's a lot of people who act like sheep, not just Christians. But this becomes a stereotype that's quite common. So we have these patterns of dehumanization. We have this irrational hatred, this irrational fear. One of the things I didn't put up there was how many times people talked about Christians want to set up a theocracy. You want to take over, set up a theocracy, you have to be a Christian, stay in this country. That's sort of this idea, an irrational fear. So you had a lot of that. But our final question is, does it matter? Maybe these people have all these there's anger and fear. But when it comes to interacting with Christians, they're fair. Because they're progressive, they're educated, they know how to separate their fears from their interactions. So let's test this. I did my research on academic bias with this question. There's a survey I sent out to academics in 9 different disciplines, and I'll read the question because I'm not sure you can see it clearly. Assume that your faculty is hiring a new professor. Below is a list of possible characteristics of this new hire. Many of them are characteristics that you cannot directly inquire of the prospective candidate. However, if you're able to learn of these characteristics about a candidate, will that make you more or less likely to support their hire? Please rank your attitude on a scale in which 1 includes that the characteristic greatly damages your support to hire the candidate, 4 in that the characteristic does not make a difference, and 7 indicates the characteristic greatly enhances your support to hire the candidate. If you do not understand the characteristic, then please indicate such with a non-applicable. A couple things. Now, and then I followed up with about 26 different groups, political groups, religious groups, lifestyle groups, sexuality groups, a lot of different groups. A couple things to note. This is not a forced choice. If the scale had been 1 to 6, you either have to say you're willing or you're not willing. That's not fair. A person may say it doesn't matter at all. The candidate has blonde hair. Well, I don't care. So they have an out. They also have an out with non-applicable. I don't understand this, so I'm just going to put non-applicable. So this was not some sort of trap to catch people. All right? So let me show you how it broke down with some selected groups. Okay? All right, we're going to look at fundamentalists, evangelicals, NRA members, Republicans, Muslims, and atheists. And these are percentage of the people who answered either 1, 2, or 3. In other words, to some degree, they're less willing to hire you if they find out this about you. Fundamentalists, about half of the academics, and it varies by discipline, but half the academics are less willing to hire you to some degree. Evangelicals, you can see that that's close to 40%. NRA members, a little bit lower than that. And then there's a pretty good drop-off Republican. Now, I'm going to just say something real quick here. I did this research. I actually thought there'd be more political bias than religious bias. And the reason why I thought this was there are organizations of Christian sociologists. I knew of Christian sociologists. I am a Christian sociologist. There are not any organizations of Republican sociologists. I know they're out there, but there's no organization of them. And to be honest, and I'm not a Republican, I'm a political moderate. To be honest, I can't tell you of a sociologist who is a Republican. I just don't know. I'm sure I know someone who are Republican, and they just have not told anyone. So I thought there'd be more political bias than religious bias. And don't tell my wife this, but I was wrong. There's more religious bias than political bias. So I actually went into this research thinking that this book was going to be about political bias, and it is, but the stronger effect is on religious bias. You can see Muslim and atheists are very low numbers as far as less willing to hire. And then the other thing you could take from the enhanced, this is people who are more willing to hire you, if they find this out, is that those groups really don't matter that much as far as making you more desirable to hire, except if you're an atheist, then that goes up to about 10%. So there's not much there. What this means is that people, in their own words, are saying, yes, I am less willing to hire you if you're a conservative Protestant. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying they're saying that they won't hire you, but what this kind of does is it makes it clear that if you're a conservative Protestant and you're going for a job, you better be better than everyone else. Now, if it was just my study, people could say, well, crazy guy, he does that weird stuff, who knows. But it's not just my study. There's other evidence supporting academic bias. The first one is a study by Inbar and Lammers. What they did was they concentrated on social psychologists. They asked them, now they just concentrated on political bias. And we just saw that religious bias is stronger than political bias. They asked them, if you found out that a colleague was a political conservative, would you be less or more willing to hire them? Less. But then they went into other areas. So if you found out this paper was written by a political conservative, would you be more or less likely to accept the paper? Less. Speaker, inviting a speaker to a symposium, political conservative, more or less likely? Less. Grant. This grant is by a political conservative, more or less likely? Less. So I put this to show that even though my research only deals with hiring, I believe that Inbars and Lammers show that this bias is not limited to just hiring. It's limited to getting published, it's limited to getting a grant, becoming a speaker. Okay? Another study, Tobin and Weinberg, they surveyed academics, and they did the thermometer scale, and they showed that about more than half of the academics rank evangelicals very low in their thermometer scales. So, you know, what I used was a natural probability sample. They just looked at academics and showed that the social group rejected the most by academics tend to be conservative Protestants. Rothman and Lichner is a very interesting study. Rothman and Lichner, they surveyed academics, and they looked at where they worked. And what they found out was that political conservatism did not necessarily have a detrimental effect on one's career if that conservatism was in economics or foreign policy. But if one was a social conservative, then those individuals tend to work at jobs that were lower status. And what they did was they controlled for academic achievement. So what that means is that it's not that those who are social conservatives accomplish less academically and they're those lower status jobs. Even when you control for that and other demographic variables, these individuals are in lower status academic jobs. And you couple that with Inbar and Lammers, you can imagine that it's going to be harder to get published if you're a social conservative, if you publish along those lines, because you're less likely to get accepted, your articles. So you have a higher bar to overcome. And even if you overcome that bar, you're going to be in lower status academic positions. And then there's the Mike Adams case. You all may be very familiar with it. Mike Adams, a criminology professor. He was an atheist, became a Christian, went up for promotion, was denied, thought something was fishy, sued his college. They did a discovery, and sure enough, they found that a major reason why his promotion was denied was they didn't like some of his writings. Some of his writings outside of academic writings. That he's a very forthcoming Christian and, you know, has a style that kind of ridicules PCism and stuff like that. And they didn't like that. And he won his case. Now, I put that case up there to show that this act, you know, there are real consequences to it. Do not think that this is the only case. I know of other cases that I cannot talk about because they were settled out of court. And, you know, as part of the settlement, they can't go public with it. So, but this one, you know, his college was stupid enough to actually go into court, and they lost the case. And so we know that here's a situation where it actually worked itself out. So basically, when people say that Christians are not discriminated against, the response is it fair that merely because of your religious belief system that you're less likely to get an academic job? Because that's what's happening. That's what my research shows. And it's hard for people to say. Now, the research that this is happening is so strong that at this point, people are not even arguing that there's a religious bias. The people who know the research. The people who don't know the research, they just spout off. They're your internet atheist trollers. People who know the research don't argue that. What they do argue is that, well, why would you want to hire someone who believes in the six-day creation? Why do you care if this person's teaching political science? Why would I want to hire someone who believes that the universe just emerged out of nothing? That seems like fancy thinking to me, but you know what? That doesn't affect the way they could teach gender or demography or anything like that, so it doesn't matter to me. So people argue, well, Christians are not discriminated against. They're a privilege. Is it a privilege to go up for a job and not have your religious beliefs held against you? So there are real consequences to that. Now, I'll spend a few minutes talking about some new research that I'm working on. It's not out yet. I need to find a publisher for it. But one of the things I was curious about is the media. Is this also an area? Because the media would also be a place where I would expect that you would find people with anti-Christian bias. So is there Christianophobia in the media? And so what I did was I got a list of reporters and editors of newspapers all across the country, created a sample from that listing, sent them out a questionnaire. In that questionnaire, I gave them a dozen scenarios, and I did what's called an audit design, where half the scenarios would have one characteristic and the other half would have a different characteristic. So I'll give you an example as it pertains to Christianity. One of the scenarios was a church was shot up. 2 people were killed, and the shooter killed himself. And then the alternate scenario would be a mosque was shot up. 2 people were killed, the shooter killed himself. So, you change this out. And after they read the scenario, I asked these respondents, where would you place this story? And then an open-ended question, why would you place it there? And I'm glad I asked that open-ended question, because that's really where the data came from. So, there's been previous research on political bias. There is a lot of research on political bias in the media. It's mixed. Some of it shows that there is a progressive bias. Some of it shows there's not. There's a little bit that shows conservative bias. We kind of don't know. But there's very little on religious bias. So that's why I did this audit study that I just told you about. And here's what I found. There's 3 of these scenarios that involve Christians. And I found the stories about Christians, there's little or no concern about anti-Christian hatred, but this was not the case for other groups. So the scenario I just told you about, what often happened was they would talk about when the shooting took place in a Christian church, the discussion was on the gunman, what made him do that. The question was sometimes about guns and the problems there are in society. Those were, why do you place it? Well, yeah, this is why I want to place it, When it was about a mosque, what often happened was questions about Islamophobia. Is there anti-Muslim hatred? Very, very rarely did they discuss anti-Christian hatred. I had another scenario about a hate speech, where a teacher either gives a homophobic slur or an anti-Christian slur. Once again, with the homophobic slur, there's a lot of discussion on hatred. With the Christian slur, anti-Christian slur, very little, and even some discussion on, people have a right to be offensive. So those were some of the, what differences in the answers I got. Christians cannot count on the media to be concerned with anti-religious bigotry. That's one of my conclusions, is that if you are not a Christian group, the media generally is going to rally to you when it comes to bigotry. Christians can't count on the media for that. The media simply doesn't see that. Now, I'm not saying that these reporters and editors are like, oh, good, yeah, church got shot up, so we got more dead Christians, that's great. Because they weren't that way at all. But they just did not think that there may be a hatred driving the shooting. And so while, they talked about being concerned about, so they talked about the victims, against reports from the victims and stuff like that. These are not monsters. It's just in their blind spot, and they don't see it. Hopefully next year it'll be out. We'll soon see. All right. Societal effects of Christianophobia. A little bit of a summary. Those with a hatred of Christians have a great deal of per capita social and cultural power. They have more cultural power than your average Christian, clearly. Powerful cultural institutions where we should find Christianophobia, and this is where we usually learn about prejudice and discrimination. Who talks about prejudice and discrimination in our society? In schools, academia, the media, the arts. This is where we really talk about these sort of things. So it's not surprising that it's off people's radar screens if Christianophobia is part of what's happening. When the culture changes, so too will society change. And so part of what we see is Christianophobia is acceptable, because we have a culture that doesn't see it as a problem. So this is why you all got some of the response you got on your Facebook page, because society sees this as acceptable. And also, although difficult to document Christianophobic discrimination, but we have evidence that it already exists. It's going to be difficult to document. A lot of educated people hide their prejudice quite well. And so we're going to have to find creative ways to document it, but we already have some evidence. So let me spend the last few minutes talking as one Christian to another. I do my academic thing. And let me, my hostile environment book really focuses in on not being an academic, but just being a fellow brother in the Lord and talking one Christian to another. Let me suggest there are two bad approaches. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, the first bad approach is to ignore Christianophobia or blame Christians for it. I can't tell you how many times I've walked across my campus and there's, one of the street preachers on the campus yelling at people that they're going to hell. Repenting, you're going to hell. And, and how embarrassing that is. There are Christians who do incredibly horrible things. We've seen that throughout our history as well. So let's not play the game that, we're totally innocent of everything. However, it's always dangerous when you start blaming people for the discrimination that they receive, because we always go too far. Are there African Americans who are criminals? Yes, there are. Does it mean that, that black men should be shot down by the police? No, it does not. We have a tendency to go too far. There is a real problem. We've already documented occupational discrimination. So one approach is, well, just ignore it, or Christians, you brought it on yourself. And I think the evidence is that this is not an accurate reading of what's happening. But there's an opposite problem as well. And that opposite problem is overreact by screaming persecution for everything. It's interesting the Michael Medved show, the very first caller. And you'll notice that tonight I've not said the word persecution until just now. The very first caller says, oh, you Christians are not being persecuted. And I never said anything about that, about persecution. Okay? And I agree that in the United States, we're not being dragged out of our homes and put in jail. We're not being killed for our faith. So I do think that when we say we're persecuted, that we over-dramatize it. And it makes us less able to have the conversation we have to have. So we shouldn't ignore it, but neither should we, say we're being persecuted, we're facing all this, we're like the Middle Eastern Christians, because we're not. So what I propose is what I call a middle ground approach. Okay, so part of this middle ground approach is we need a conversation among us Christians. And I love this program that y'all have, because a lot of this conversation is going to be among Christians who are a little bit more educated, intellectually based, because a lot of the ideas come from the intellectuals. And we need Christian intellectuals to really discuss how we're going to approach this. First, let's recognize that we're no longer the dominant religious group in the United States. That's just the reality of it. At one time, Christians could get away with things because they were the dominant group in the United States. That is no longer the case. You can like it, you can hate it. I'm just telling you what the reality is. And so from that, then, we need to rethink of our position in the United States and how we're going to operate. We need to be ready to defend our place in the public square. One of the things, I didn't bring this out, one of the things that people with Christianophobia tend to do is, rather than say, well, we should go into churches and drag them out of their churches, they say, you can have your religion in your churches, in your homes, and nowhere else. So it's a way to keep Christians out of the public square. Now, my response to that is, we ask that of no one else. We do not tell feminists, you can take your feminist philosophy in your organizations, in your homes, but nowhere else. We do not ask LGBT people, stay in your homes, your organizations, nowhere else. So why should Christians be limited that way? We need to confront that. We need to confront that intellectually and hopefully, if we can, legally. I also think that we need to become unified in the body of Christ. A lot of my early work on race was about that unification across racial lines. We need some unification across denominational lines. The differences that we've had in the past, we could have because we were the dominant religious group. So if we didn't get along with each other, well, that's okay. But as we move from that position of not being the dominant group, it becomes important that we don't allow artificial divisions keep us apart. Our differences are okay. Our differences are okay, but I think we're going to need each other. We need allies that we haven't had in the past. And so, one of the things we have to do is think about how can we overcome these differences. Why do our churches have to be competitors? If one church has a really great program, let's let them do it and let other people go to that church and do that program, and then they can Sunday morning be in their other church. We need to stop competing against each other because we have a greater problem. And then finally, we need to integrate into mainstream cultural institutions. I work at a state university. There's nothing wrong with a Christian college. However, we've put so much resources into a Christian college that to some degree we've abandoned the public university. And in that abandonment, Christianophobia can grow because you're not around people. They don't get to know you. They don't get to humanize you. They can dehumanize you as childlike. I think very few people in my life think of me as childlike because they get to know me. So we have to, I'm not saying let's not do Christian media or let's not do Christian colleges or let's not do Christian arts or entertainment, but we also must have some people who are called to go into the mainstream. And when you do that, do good quality work, do a good movie, do good art, do good research, and as we do that, we can winsomely win over people. This is a long-term project. It's not going to happen overnight. We need to think of ourselves as a Christian community, and part of the community is to protect ourselves is to enter into the mainstream of society. Okay, and just a couple of words on the books. The one over on your left, Hostile Environment, it's an InterVarsity Press book. So the academic stuff, the stats, it's not there. So if you don't, if that's the sort of stuff you don't want, that's the book. The other two books are academic books. I try to put the technical stuff in the appendixes, but they are academic books. Compromising Scholarship is about academic bias, and then So Many Christians, So Few Lions is about Christianophobia. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for that. We have ample time for question and answers. We've got one of the things we want to do is make sure that we capture these questions on tape because this is being recorded. There's nothing more frustrating than listening to or watching a DVD and you don't hear the question and then someone answers. So we have two mics. One of my friends Eric will have a mic as well. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. Do not forget these books. They're both at the Hostile Environment, So Many Christians, So Few Lions. We have copies back there. If you're not on the Areopagus mailing list, be sure that you do sign up for that if you'd like to know about future events. And I've been told that there's a crackle in your head mic, and for Q&A, if you could just speak into this stand mic, that would give us a better quality, okay? So, because no one likes to ask the first question, I'll ask the first question. Dr. Yancey, you mentioned 3 questions at the beginning. Does it exist? How big does it matter? Could you kind of summarize that for us as to how you feel that plays out, and then we'll open the floor.
Well, I think I showed that there is an irrational hatred of Christians when you can buy a baby onesie joking about feed them to lions. I think I've showed that if Islamophobia is a problem, and I believe that it is, okay? I'm not here just saying, well, Islamophobia, that's not a big problem, but Christianophobia, that's a really big. Islamophobia is a problem. There are Muslims who have been beaten up, killed because of Islamophobia in the United States. But if it is a problem, so too must Christianophobia be a problem, because the same percentage of people with animosity towards Muslims have animosity towards conservative Christians. And those people are actually more powerful. And then finally, when I touched on my research on academic bias, I showed that Christians do pay a price for this bias, not in everywhere, not in all places, but in certain important places like academia, they do pay a cost for this bias. So in that way, I think I answered all 3 of those questions.
And who would like to ask a question? Sophia.
It's me. Okay, so in your study, I know that you said you asked people if they're more or less likely to hire someone who's a Protestant Christian or fundamentalist, as you put it. Other than asking people if they're more or less likely to hire someone who is Muslim, did you ask about any other religious groups to see if these people were just generally anti-religious rather than just generally anti-Christian?
Yes, I did. And of course, I couldn't put them all up there. But I asked about Catholics, I asked about mainline Protestants, I asked about Jews, I asked about Mormons. So I asked about 7 or 8 different religious groups for the very reason that you pointed out. I also asked about atheists as well, as you saw up there. So, and not only was the fundamentalists the most rejected group, and evangelicals the second most rejected group among religious groups, they were among all groups. So.
Thank you.
I have one here.
You mentioned that public universities, how difficult it is for Christian to be hired, and not only once they're hired, how difficult it is to advance into increasing levels of responsibility. And then you mentioned at the end how it's important that we begin to take back these areas in terms of establishing a presence not only in Christian universities but in public universities. And how would you suggest that the body of Christ do that in terms of if they don't have the responsibility in the academic, and if they're not invited as speakers? That was another point you made, is that not only are not hired, they're not have the ability to speak. So where is the opportunity? In other words, how do we get through the gate and achieve what your goal is as far as getting back into the public universities?
Sure. More difficult, but not impossible. And I can name you off Christians in academia who have achieved quite a bit. So it is going to be more difficult. I tell Christian scholars, young Christian scholars, look, you've really got to make sure your work is good. Because it's not impossible, but you really got to make sure your work is good. I'm working on a project right now with a Christian professor. And she may be surprised how much work we're doing in this project. But I know how rigorously our project is going to be critiqued. So, it means you have to work harder. There's no 2 ways about it. I think over time, as more Christians enter into, say, academia, it'll get easier because there'll be more of a presence. But up here at first, It is going to be harder, but it's not impossible to do.
I have one over here. Jerry? Over here. Over here.
Three-part question here. Going on what Pat just asked, how do you get back in the door? It seems like, I think you said that, hey, we are no longer the majority, we're down in one of the minority groups. Why is it that we do not see cropping up civil rights violations relative to individuals being restricted from doing this or that, even though the law was written, obviously, under other circumstances? Second question, which I've actually asked another professor who was sitting there a month or two ago, and he didn't answer it. Because tenure was placed by all states to protect the university or the education, the professors from expressing their views and from not being, I won't use the word persecuted, but damaged because of certain views, and that by far it seems a large amount of the universities have now been taken control by the same people you've been talking about. Why should we keep tenure, and why should we not go to the legislation? Because tenure is already under a lot of pressure because of the professors not being adequately teaching or whatever. Why shouldn't we abolish tenure and wipe out the ability for people to use that particular political power?
Okay. Can you remind me of your first question? That's probably
the civil rights.
Civil rights, okay.
Yeah, I mean, because it seems like we're moving toward that type of violation, even though the law was written for something else.
We, as humans, believe what our culture tells us. We, as humans, are not very logical. We believe what our culture tells us. Our culture, and I think I'm showing evidence of this, our culture tells us that there is not anti-Christian bias. So if that's what we believe, then people are not going to believe there are civil rights violations because they don't believe anti-Christian bias exists. So, that's one of the reasons why we have to be in the culture. We have to, I'm not talking about kids taking over the culture. I'm talking about changing it to a more accurate reflection of what's happening. And then, it's possible. But just going the legal route, and here's the critique I have of Christians. Christians are concentrating on the legal and political route, and they've eschewed the cultural route. And the culture will drive the other two eventually. Maybe not short term, but long term it will. This presidential election, if the culture does not change, it really doesn't matter who's going to win long term, honestly. So culture has to be part of that. Your second question on tenure. You do not want, if you're a minority group, you do not want the end of tenure. Let me tell you why. I did not do my stuff on Christianophobia until I had tenure. See where I'm coming from? No tenure, then at any point, people can say, the stuff you're doing, it's horrible, we're going to let you go. With tenure, I have extra protection. So if anything, we should want tenure more than others. The atheist does not need tenure to protect his or her atheism. So I would be against any program to get rid of tenure because I'm part of an ideological minority group in academia.
I have a question down here in front.
Hello. Actually, I think you answered the question already, but I was asking with Christianophobia being controlled by the public square and media and academia and things of that nature, do you see a trend, or have you seen some studies showing a pattern of evidence of a trend that's spreading off of, away from the demographics you're talking about to maybe the less educated and have you seen that trend?
No, I've not seen that trend yet. So, and it'd be hard for me to, because there's not many people doing research on this. So I won't say I'm the only one, but there's not a lot of research on this that have that sort of data. If you're studying anti-Semitism or racism or homophobia, there's a lot of studies, and you probably could document a trend like that. But the data just is not out there at this point. Hopefully in time we'll see what might happen. It'll also be hard to collect that sort of data because if you've not already collected it, then it's hard to get that sort of longitudinal data. You have to start someplace and then collect it over a period of time in order to really do it.
Yes, I was here I am. I was curious whether or not you were able to tease out or distinguish between whether or not Christianophobia is about Christians or is about a group that has been culturally dominant for a while. And related to that, I was wondering how much of this is related to, say, the 80s and 90s when there was such a strong political connection between Christian conservatism and political conservatism.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of it, yes. That's definitely my respondents talked about, well, you know, and the response of, if Christians just stay in their homes and churches, we don't care about them, that reflects that reality. And so, you know, things have changed. In the 80s and 90s, Christians were a dominant group. They're no longer a dominant group. You know, is politics the way Christians want to express themselves? In the 80s and 90s, the question was yes. I would say Christians need to rethink that question at this point, because politics is 50 plus 1. And if you're not the dominant group, then you're the minority group and you don't have any political power. But culture, but intellectual challenge, those things a minority group can do and have influence.
Dr. Yancey, back here.
To clarify some of the findings you gave us from your study, how many original survey respondents were there? 3,000, did you say?
Which one? Are you talking about
That was my other part of my question. You had a national survey, and then you gave some results. You gave some results for that, and then you gave results for the cultural progressive activists?
Right, the cultural progressive activists is about 4,000.
Okay.
Yes.
And what was the original on your finding?
Because I didn't collect this data myself, I'm not exactly sure about the numbers. I think it's about 5,000 in it's the American National Election Survey, so you can look that up.
Okay.
It's a well-known, established survey.
And one other question. I missed the context of why you gave us the information about Haslam's theory of animalistic dehumanization. How does that relate to what you found?
Well, I want to show that this wasn't just about people saying something hateful, that there was a systematic dehumanization of Christians. And because of my time, I couldn't go through all five steps, so I chose one and showed you some quotes to illustrate how this sort of operates. You know, if I had more time, I could even go in that data even further and talk about what they want out of Christians. I could talk about bigotry and hatred and stuff like that. But I chose that to illustrate that this is not just some hyperbole. There are systematic patterns of dehumanization in the data.
And is this a widely accepted sociological theory, these 5 things? Or is this
it's fairly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't do that.
Okay.
Haslam, and I think it's the best model of dehumanization that's out there. People may disagree with me on that, but
Yeah,
I think it is.
Right. I just want to clarify because I didn't know.
He also had there's just a little aside, he also had a different type of dehumanization, which was more mechanical. But that didn't fit the data, because more dehumanizing people because they're machines, they're numbers in a crowd, they're emotionalists. That's not how my respondents talked about the Christians. So this type of animalistic dehumanization fit the data a lot better.
Right here. I was just wondering, what do you attribute the shift in this view of the Christians? I mean, it hasn't always been that way. What do you is that get into your research, or what's happened?
That's the one question people ask me over and over again that I don't have a good answer. You know, and maybe one day I should just take 24 hours and just think about it, and come with a really good answer. Part of me thinks that because Christians left the cultural mainstream, that allowed this to happen. But I'm not sure that that's the entire answer. One possible answer is that in the 80s and 90s, there was so much cultural pressure to be a Christian that if you were a nominal Christian, you went to church Christmas and Easter, and well, you still saw yourself as a Christian, and you still identified as such, and you voted as such, and that was your in-group, even though you really wasn't that important to you. As respect for Christianity has fallen away, those individuals have said, well, yeah, I go to church every now and then, but I'm not with those people. And as our culture has stigmatized Christians a little bit, it's been making it easier for people to go, I'm not with those people. So it may be that the percentage of people who who did not see Christians as a salient identity has not changed. But that group in the middle that was not hostile, but not very highly religious, that group has changed their allegiance. And that may be what's happening as well. These are not the best answers, but I don't have longitudinal data, and I've not done a historical study to really come up with a really good answer to that question.
Here we are in front.
So have you experienced anti-Christian bias yourself in your publications? I notice your book is published by InterVarsity Press. Did you try secular publishers?
Not with that book, no, because it was never intended to be an academic book. I will say that when I was publishing race stuff, I sent papers out. Sometimes they would get revised and resubmit, and those of your academics know what that means. Sometimes they get rejected. And revised, resubmits. Usually I was able to revise them enough to get published. I send papers out today, and it's a lot harder. And one thing that's happened that did not happen to me when I was publishing race is that reviewers are actually questioning my intentions and my motivations. They'll put that right in the review, well, this person's trying to da. And some of the, as an academic, one of the things that prepared me as an academic was I used to referee football games. So I developed very thick skin. And some of the most vicious reviews I get now as opposed to, so I do think there's a difference. I do think it's hard for me to get into the better journals now on this topic than I did with race. My race books, I'm published with Oxford Press. These books, Rowman and Littlefield, they're a fine publisher, but they're not Oxford Press. So yeah, I do think that there is something to that.
And I'm sure you've given presentations in secular audiences and so on of some of this. What kind of response do you get from, I hear we're kind of a homogeneous group,
right,
perhaps, but I'm just...
There's some people who question. The most interesting response I get is people who go, wow, that's the way I think. Is there a problem with that? And not the Christians in lines, but as far as thinking Christians can't critically think and this sort of stuff. And so I'm hoping that it helps them to at least, I don't ask people to agree with me 100% because no one agrees with me 100%, but at least be a little bit introspective about some of the religious biases that they sometimes have. So that's the most interesting response that I get when I talk in a secular audience.
Other questions?
I'm curious about the fact that you said that Christianity is no longer the dominant religious group in the United States. My guess would be that atheism is probably the most dominant, but I wouldn't call that a religious group. So could you break down for us what is the dominant religious group in the United States?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if there is one at this point. I just don't think so. And by dominant, I'm not talking about numbers, because there's still more Christians than anyone else in the United States. When I talk about dominance, I'm talking about majority-minority group, and a majority group has disproportionate power to their numbers. Christians used to have that. They don't have that today. Given what I showed on atheists, on how much they're rejected, I would really be hesitant to call them the dominant group, because a lot of people still don't like atheists. And there are surveys that show that they're the group least likely to be selected as president of the United States. So I just think we're in a flux. Will atheism become the dominant group, say, 10 years from now? That's entirely possible. But I can't say that they are today because of other research. I just think we're in this weird point in time where we don't have a dominant religious group.
Do you think it varies a lot around the country? I do, because where we live, most people, I'm never hesitant to bring up a spiritual conversation, because it seems like in every group I'm in, public school, everywhere, there are Christians in the group. So I guess I'm a little surprised by that, and obviously that's not the case. Is it very much skewed to the South? Or?
Well, yeah, it varies by if you go to the coast, West Coast, East Coast, that won't be your experience. So the South is its own unique animal in this question. So, but especially the Northeast. Northeast is very secular. So, you know, as far as spirituality questions, a lot of people there don't want to hear it.
Eric, did you have one question over there?
Yes, you talked about the discrimination against the professors in the universities. What about the incoming students? Do you see anything? Have you studied that at all? Or do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've not studied students per se. It's kind of difficult to study students. They're a captive audience, literally. There is some research that suggests that Christians on a secular campus do face discrimination. It's not systematic enough for me to go, okay, yeah, it's there. I'm actually working in conjunction with a group of academics to create a measure for students to perceive how comfortable they are on academic campuses. We jokingly call it our eggshell-o-meter. You know, do you have to walk on eggshells on an academic campus? I'm very interested in the results of that. Now, this is just my suspicion. So, you know, I'm not going to say this is true. I don't know. I could be totally different. My suspicion is that Christian students are going to score very low in being comfortable on college campuses, especially if they're conservative Christian students. So that may be the first real data that we really have that's more systematic. The other stuff that I've seen has been like on 1 or 2 universities. And I'm hesitant to generalize that out to the rest of the country.
Other questions? Yeah, down here.
Your last point about the type of ways that we could combat was integrate into mainstream cultural institutions. Could you explain what that would look like without compromising our values to integrate? What would that look like?
Sure. Go to Hollywood, you work your way up, you become producer, actor, actress. You work on movies. You may select certain movies you don't want to work on, but you know, you work on a lot of movies that are not Christian in nature. As you gain power in the industry, then you can put together movies that are high quality movies that have a Christian message. And for me, they would be movies in which the message is not always obvious. Because when it's too obvious, then a lot of Christians go and no one else goes to it. So that's the way I would see it in Hollywood. In academia, you go to graduate school, you get your doctorate, you start doing research, good quality research. A lot of my stuff on race has nothing to do with Christianity. I've published on racial identity, I've published on interracial families, has nothing to do with Christianity. So you do good quality work. And then as you get in a position, you can do work that can help the church. And also people get to know you as a Christian and they go, oh yeah, you don't have 3 noses. You know, you are a normal person, per se. Same thing with media and the arts. That's kind of what I mean. Not going in and say, okay, by golly, I'm gonna do my dissertation on, and I would actually not suggest a person doing a direct dissertation on Christianophobia at that stage of their career. Maybe it could be part of their dissertation, but probably not a direct part of it. But you get into academia, you learn how to do good academics, and then you go and you perform. That's how I see it would look like. Enough Christians doing that, I think, would change the culture in our society.
Questions? Over there. Eric, behind you.
It's interesting to me, the areas that you selected there, and I was curious, this may be getting a little too arcane, but all of those areas are what Gramsci referred to as security switches. That those are areas that Marxists should penetrate, the leftists should penetrate, the media, academia, the entertainment, and all of those things. And I was just curious, and I don't know how familiar you are with him, but whether or not that has had a profound influence on how things have shifted in our culture. this idea of the long march through the institutions.
Right. It's interesting. I hadn't thought much about it. With the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, socialism used to be, if you told a politician, hey, you're a socialist, the politician would go, how dare you lie about me? Bernie Sanders says, hey, I'm a socialist. And so what that indicates is, among the young folks at least, and socialism is not the exact same as communism, of course, but the idea of the collective is not as taboo as it once was. So, it's not an area I've studied, but it wouldn't surprise me if we find out that one of the reasons why that is not is that academia and media and arts have contributed to a cultural understanding of the collective that makes it more palatable, at least to the younger group. So yeah, I'm open to that possibility.
If you don't mind, I'll take the power of the microphone and sneak in a question.
Oh, can I ask one since you already had one?
Oh. Nice guy that I am, yes.
I was wondering, has there been any major academic criticism of your work? And if so, how have you responded?
I can't think of any really major criticism at this point. What's interesting is that when you show all the evidence of bias, usually the response is something to the effect of, well, of course, you don't want to hire Christians. So it's not really a criticism of my work, but a criticism of, well, yeah, we don't want to hire Christians because they can't think, because they believe in six-day creation, because of yada yada yada. I would say that methodologically, there is, if someone really wanted to go after compromising scholarship, they could go after my response rates. And we talked about this at dinner. But I really worked to show that my results were not due to low response rates. And so I don't think that I'm as vulnerable there. But that's the only real methodological criticism that I could think of.
You had shown some charts earlier about people who had admitted to being less inclined to hire a Christian or whatever on the basis of that piece of knowledge in a hiring decision. Have you or has anyone looked at what these people actually believe about Christianity? Do we understand how far off they are, or like as you say, well, there's six-day. Well, there are plenty of six-day creationists, but they're all down here in the South, and these are just views of Christianity that are not appropriate. Does anyone try to understand what they're thinking and where they're getting these impressions from outside of the media?
Well, to one degree, my stuff on Christianophobia, my sample was not academics, but it was people who are highly educated, wealthy, people who tend to be academics. So I think that shows some of their thought patterns. I did recently have a paper published where we asked academics how you define an evangelical, a fundamentalist, a mainline Protestant. And so we got some interesting comments. A lot of them matched up to what I found in So Many Christians, So Few Lions. And so I do think that book really does show how academics think about Christians.
Other questions? Over there.
Earlier, when you were talking about trying to get you were trying to get published, you mentioned a term, revise and submit. That doesn't mean what it sounds like, because it would seem like you're compromising the integrity of your data.
Oh, no. That's pretty common.
Right.
You see it in a publication, reviewers critique it, and the editor likes it enough, he or she sends it back to you, and they say, I can't accept it as is, but here's the comments that I want you to revise. You can resubmit it, and then I can see whether or not I can accept that. That is pretty standard in academia.
So it doesn't reverse the data?
No, they may ask you to do certain things with the data. They may ask you, why didn't you do this test, or have you thought about this, or have you applied? So, and you may come out with a little bit different result if the new tests show you something different. But that's not compromise per se. Now, I will say there was one case where the revise and resubmit was so extensive that I thought that if I did the changes, it would not say what I think it should have said. And so I didn't do that one. But usually I do the revise and resubmits, and I eventually get them accepted. And I have basically the same article that I had before. A lot of times it's a better article.
You do hear this criticism, and I think your data showed it, that Christians are maybe not that intelligent or not that well educated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I look around the room here and people I know, and there's PhDs and master's degrees and all that sort of thing. But have there ever been a study that characterizes Christians against the normal population? Are evangelicals, fundamentalists, are we better educated or not as well educated or not as successful?
There is demographic data on that, yeah. Christians tend to have lower levels of education than the general population. And what else you asked me about? Okay, a couple of things. If you just looked at bivariate analysis, you'll find that Christians score lower than non-Christians when it comes to education, income, that sort of stuff. Now, part of that may be, and I've not looked at the research to see if they control for this sort of stuff, because women are more likely to be Christian than men. Great for us male Christian guys, not so good for Christian women, and sex ratio and all that. Blacks are more likely to be Christians than whites. So when you're thinking about groups that are not as well educated, not as wealthy, women and minorities, they come into play. I'm not sure that explains it completely, but that will be a start to looking at this. I also tend to think that it may be, and this is just off the top of my head, it may be that Christians are more likely to focus on taking care of their families a little bit more, and thus you sacrifice some of your achievement. I think that's a possibility. It'd be interesting to test that and see. So those are a couple of explanations, but just looking at pure differences, that is true. Christians are less educated and they're less wealthy than non-Christians on average.
Evangelicals versus fundamentalists.
Same thing. Well, evangelicals versus fundamentalists, evangelicals are better off than fundamentalists as far as education and income. But evangelicals score below the average on those qualities as well.
And who would like to ask the last question? Oh, back there.
Oh, no. The last question seems very ominous. Sarah can ask. Oh, okay. I was just wondering how you got this couple thousand person survey out, and how that may or may not have affected your data collection.
Sure. You're talking about the cultural progressive one?
Yes, that one.
Yeah, and it does, because I never said it's a probability sample, because it's a qualitative research. So once again, I'm looking more in depth. I basically contacted organizations, said, hey, I'm doing this survey. Would you be willing to send the survey out to members of your organization? And voila, I got 4,000 hits. So that's basically what happened. Several organizations across the country. But it's not a probability sample, but it does allow us to go more in depth into how people are thinking.
Just because, so you said that they were willing to send out people from their organization. So did they select people?
No.
Or so these people volunteered?
They just had an email list. They sent a link to the survey on the email list. Boom.
And did they know the topic of the survey prior to taking the survey?
We have to have a informed consent form. In that informed consent form, we discuss the topic of the survey. Now, I will say that I don't lie on the informed consent form, but I don't tell the whole entire truth either. I don't know what I put on that informed consent form, what I was talking about. I think I was, I don't know if I think I said that we were looking at attitudes towards the Christian right, which that was what we were doing. But yeah, so that's how they know what the survey is going to be about, and they can opt out of the survey at any time. If they think, oh, I'm offended by this question, they can opt out of the survey. So that's how we handle that.
Because the reason I asked that was just I was thinking if they knew the topic of the survey was opinions about the Christian right, prior to taking the survey, then people that had stronger views that were anti-Christian were more likely to answer the survey, possibly.
Are you a sociology major?
No, I'm not. I have no idea. I'm just thinking.
I mean, that's a possibility. The thing is, though, I don't know the email that was sent out, but they were told on the informed consent form before they entered the survey. So I don't think that would really be a problem. And even if that was the case, because this is qualitative and not quantitative, I never said that this is a representative sample. It's not a probability sample. We did this because we wanted the short answers, open and short answer questions, which will give us rich, nuanced, qualitative data.
Let's show our appreciation to Dr. Yancey.